We're going to consider now how ideas have a way of inspiring artists across centuries. And we're going to be considering a poem by William Butler Yeats. The poem is called Sailing to Byzantium. There are several aspects of the poetry that we're going to now consider. These are some of the elements and principles that are found in poetry, and in all art forms for that matter. But the specific application we'll be able to see and hear in this particular poem. One that is most frequently considered is rhyme. And there are two types of rhymes that are most common. That's assonance and consonance. Assonance is a rhyme of the vowel sounds, and consonance is a rhyme of the consonants. So you can have different types of rhymes. You can have open sounding rhymes or very percussive rhymes. Again, is it a vowel rhyme or is it a consonant rhyme? There are, in this particular poem, there are couplets where one line will couple with another line in terms of its rhyme. Sometimes rhymes will even occur in the middle of lines, as well as at the end of lines. Most poems where there's a strong rhyming scheme, we are most aware of it at the end of the rhyming lines. But you can also have rhymes at the start, the middle, or the end. And part of the artistry of a poet is to be able to structure these rhymes in such a way and to select very specific words that imbue the poem with meaning, and the rhyme structure brings out certain emphasis on certain words. So it helps to highlight or creates a form of word painting, a painting or a colorizing of certain words to help project the meaning of the poem. Rhythm is another very important aspect of poetry. Words themselves create rhythms. The way words stack up creates rhythms. The way things are created through syllables, that creates rhythms. And there's also something known as poetic meter, where you have strong pulses and weak pulses, and slows and fasts. And this combination of poetic meter and also the rhyme and rhythm of words will give a poet a very powerful way of working. Now, there's another aspect, and that's how specific words are used for their literary color or even their texture. How do the words sound? What is the sonic characteristic of the word? And then also, is this word specific to a time period? Is this word specific to an artistic discipline? Is this word specific to a culture? But words are also used for their literary color or texture. How the ideas are organized into stanzas and into some type of narrative it creates, that's also very important in poetry. If we get lost in the middle of the poem, it loses its effectiveness. But if the poet can force us to focus on the poetry and the elements and principles that are being used, this will help a great deal. So here's how architecture or form is created. Form is created through one of four methods in any particular art form. The first, most likely way is to repeat something through repetition. So if you were diagramming the structure of a poem, you might say the A section. That's a particular idea, a particular set of characteristics, particular colors, particular rhythms. But to repeat it is simply to repeat it verbatim, A and A. We might actually change, in the poem we might change the words around, but the structure and the form continues on with that same idea. So you have A and A. Another is to create variation or to modify something slightly. So you'd have something marked as an A, but then it changes around a bit. So we would mark it as an A prime if we were going to map out its structure. The next most common method of creating form or architecture in a poem is contrast. And that is to go do something completely differently. So you have an A section and a B section, or a C section, or a D section, and so forth. In music, there are some very interesting musical forms that are based upon these ways of creating form. And it's interesting because sometimes when poets use these structures, they begin to take on a very musical quality. One is called a rondo, which is a musical form, and it comes from the Old French word ronde, which is something that's round or circular. In other words, it implies that something keeps coming back. So you have an A section, then you have a B section, then the A section returns. Then you go on to something else, maybe a C section. Then the A section comes back. The whole idea is that there is this continual repetition of a section. But that's a way to combine repetition with contrast, for example, to create a formal structure. The fourth one is a silence, pause, or stopping. In the visual arts, it would be a section of the canvas that's white or black or a single color where there's no particular activity taking place. There's no content aside from just something there that's taking space. But silence is very important in art because it gives an articulation, it gives a structure to the art form, and it allows the audience member to soak it in for just a moment. Sometimes it's nice just to have a pause in the middle of a poem. And when one is reading poetry, either visually or verbally, it is most effective to have those moments of pause to allow the listener to take it all in. So we're going to begin with this particular poem, and it's in 4 sections, and this is the first section. That is no country for old men, the young, in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song. The salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl, command all summer long. Whatever is begotten, born and dies. Caught in that sensual music all neglect, monuments of unaging intellect. So he's using a lot of very colorful descriptive words in this first stanza of the poem. A lot of very specific words. He's talking about life and death. He's talking about aging. He's talking about all these things. Let's listen to the poem, this first section, one more time, just to kind of soak this in, because this helps to lay the groundwork for the particular poem. That is no country for old men, the young, in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song. The salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl, commend all summer long. Whatever is begotten, born and dies. Caught in that sensual music all neglect, monuments of unaging intellect. So I hope that you noticed a slight difference in the way I read the stanza the first time and the way I read the stanza the second time. The first time I was concentrating more upon the specific words I was going by, and in the second one I was trying to give you a more theatrical or musical rendition of the poem. We should always strive for the theatrical or the musical in reading poetry because that's the essential nature of it. But anyway, let's consider a little bit about some of the meaning and some of the important highlights of this particular first stanza. That is no country for old men. Very important first line. He has this imagery of teeming fish spawning. This is what people of youth concentrate on. They concentrate on their relationships, sometimes sensual or sexual relationships. But he's creating this analogy of teeming fish and all different kinds of fish. Fish that go up the fish ladder in order to breed and produce. So he's really not even talking about Byzantium yet. Yeats is really just talking about the difference between being an old person and being a young person. He speaks about sensual music. He also has an interesting rhyme between neglect and intellect. Now, if we look at the formal structure of the scheme of this particular passage, we have an A, a B, an A, a B, an A, a B, and a C, and a C. Okay? So, considering the formal structure as we look forward, we have the formal structure for this particular passage. Going on to the second passage now. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul claps its hands and sing, and louder sing, for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is there singing school, but studying, monuments of its own magnificence, and therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. Now he's choosing words very specifically. He could have said, I've come to the holy city of Constantinople, which is in the Middle Ages. That is the name of the city. It was named after Emperor Constantine. But the holy city of Constantinople, no, he says Byzantium, because he's speaking of it in an idealized kind of way. He's not talking about a specific city, although that is essentially what he's speaking of. He's speaking more of a time frame and a concept and a station in history. To the holy city of Byzantium. He could have said to the city of Istanbul, because Istanbul, Turkey, was Constantinople and the heart of Byzantium in the Middle Ages. And therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. Once again, let's take another pass at this particular section. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul claps its hands and sing, and louder sing, for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnificence. And therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. So he's talking about a life journey here. He's talking about, in the very first section, he's reflected upon youth versus age. He's talked about his own station in life. He's talked about how he is reaching the end of his career, perhaps, or the end of his life. But yet he has arrived at this magnificent place known as Byzantium. Some of the important words: an aged man, soul clap, and singing. Again, he's using very strong contrasts. No singing school. Monuments of own magnificence. Therefore sailed the seas to come to the holy city of Byzantium. He's bringing all these images together. He's talking about how he has evolved as a person over time. And now he's arrived at a particular point in his life where he's ready to embrace something that's both ancient and monumental. Here's the third section. O sages standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of a wall, come from the holy fire, purn in a gyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and fasten to a dying animal, it knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. So again, you'll notice these rhymes, you'll notice this very colorful language he's using, and there's some very special and unusual words and things that he's describing. For one thing, he's talking about these gold mosaics of a wall and sages standing in God's holy fire. He's referring to some of the great mosaic walls on some of the churches of Constantinople. He's talking about, again, this awe-inspiring imagery that's there, that is sealed in time, so to speak. Come from the holy fire, purn in a gyre. Now, purn being that motion, but a gyre is an image that shows up in some of his other poetry as well. We'll talk about that just in a second. Consume my heart away, sick with disease, and fastened to a dying animal. So he knows his own mortality. He knows what's coming. He knows that he doesn't have forever to live. It knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. So all things of splendor, beauty, creation, that are part of eternity. Again, it's part of this mysticism of the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine culture, the emphasis on the spiritual. All these things are all coming together. So again, here are some of the key words here. The sages standing. So on this mosaic of wall, there's a whole line of people from ancient times. Become singing masters of my soul. There's an allusion to things Greek there at that point. There's a reference to things Greek because the Byzantine culture was based very heavily upon Greek culture. The Christian Byzantine Empire emerged from the earlier Christian Greek Empire. Purn in a gyre. Now, that is an image of a falcon's gyre, which is used in another poem he wrote in 1919, The Second Coming. And a falcon's gyre is that spiral that begins very far out and closes in closer and closer and closer until the falcon finally sees the mouse or the small animal that it wants to attack, and it swoops down and gets its meal this way. But it's very slow, and it's very methodical and very specific. Heart sick with the disease, and then hit the animal illusion, the allusion to him being like an animal. He's mortal flesh. And again, the artifice of eternity. the things created that are of great beauty that one day he'll be able to enter into. But this singing masters of the soul, in the Greek culture, there was a great emphasis on singing as well as athletics. You know of the Olympics, but singing was considered a sport in the time of the Greeks. And one who sang masterfully was honored some of the same accolades that a Greek Olympic athlete would receive as well. You know, the honor, the prestige, the recognition, the crown of laurels. So again, he's pulling different cultures together, and he's trying to give us snapshots of the images of the Byzantine Empire and what Byzantium would have been like in the Middle Ages. Here's section 4. This wraps up the work. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as a Grecian goldsmith makes of hammered gold and gold enameling, to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what is past or passing or to come. So he's playing with time here. What is past or passing to come? He talks about this thing about a form of a Grecian goldsmith to make. Let's move ahead and let's look at some of these words. So, Grecian goldsmiths. There was a heavy trade in ancient Greece of goldsmiths creating small idols that would be kept in the households of these gods, and people would worship these idols. The goldsmiths also made small gold items that could be taken to sacrifice in a temple, such as the temple of Artemis. The drowsy emperor, as time goes by, there was a lot of changing of leadership of the hands, and there was eventually a point where the drowsy emperor slept a little bit too much, and Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire, fell at the hands of those involved in the Islamic faith. So Constantinople became overtaken by, was no longer ruled by Christian rule, but by Islamic rule. And in fact, one of the great Christian churches, Hagia Sophia, was originally a Christian church, even though it's a central plan footprint, with everything happening in the middle and the great dome covering that, because that was characteristic of that part of the world in terms of architecture. Even though it was originally a Christian church, it then became taken over and became one of the largest mosques in the world. And to this day, you can go and see it. It's no longer functioning as a mosque. It is, again, functioning. It's more of a museum. It's more of a public building now through the secularization of Turkey in the early 20th century. But again, the drowsy emperor, he was asleep at the wheel, and the Byzantine Empire crumbled because of that. The lords and ladies of Byzantium, if you look on these great Christian churches, and when I'm speaking great, I'm speaking very large, huge monumental churches of the Byzantine Empire, especially in Constantinople, you will see numerous individuals on the walls of these churches as mosaics. And it's this procession of the lords and ladies that Yeats saw when he visited Constantinople once. Now here's perhaps one of the most interesting parts: past, passing, and to come. And he's talking about time. He's talking about the various states of time and the various conjugations of time. And he's talking about things that are past, that have completed in its entirety, things that are passing, things that are still present with us, but they're evolving in some way and leading to the future. And then he's also speaking about the far future, things that have not yet taken place but are to come. It's a very theological, religious way of looking at time in the world. And there is interesting sacred scriptures in numerous religions that talk about this kind of time frame when they're speaking about eternity. Things past, things passing, and things to come. So here are some questions. How could this poem be an artistic response to an experience or thoughts? And what clues are embedded within the poem? We've spoken about that. We've spoken about what appears to be his self-reflection upon his own aging and the maturity and the benefit you have of that, but yet the feebleness that the body acquires over time, unfortunately. He has the intellect and the wherewithal to do almost anything, but yet he has reached an age in his life where his body limits him severely. And he's thinking about what it's going to be like to perhaps pass on. So here's the question: is this poem about an actual journey? And we spoke about this. No, it's really not an actual journey. It's more of a spiritual journey, or it's an analogy to a journey in time. But it's not about him physically going to Constantinople or Istanbul. It is about his imagination and looking at things from other civilizations, other cultures in antiquity. What's the connection to Byzantium? Why Byzantium? Again, we spoke about this. He's thinking more of a time in history and about a culture. Not specifically Constantinople or Istanbul, although this poem is based heavily. If you look at the language, the specific words that are chosen, you can see that he was really talking about the experience of the city. We also spoke about the references to the monuments, the Grecian goldsmiths, and the drowsy emperor. We see an encapsulation of how Constantinople grew over time and then eventually fell and became Istanbul, renamed after it fell to the Islamic warriors. So Yeats wrote this poem in 1926, and he was about 60 or 61 at the time. We're not exactly sure precisely when he started the poem, when he ended the poem, but it was completed in 1926. So he was around this time, and that's a very good age, but yet that is an age where people begin to think a little bit back upon their life experience. There are 4 stanzas we've identified, and they have specific functions. Each stanza, each section is talking about a specific aspect of his reflection and his experience. The first one is a more general, open idea of what youth is all about. The second section talks about his personal experience with aging, and then we go on from there. It is written in a particular style. It's written actually in an Italian poetic scheme known as ottavia rima, which is 8 lines or 8 rhymes. So these stanzas were consisting of 8 lines with 10 syllables each. Okay, so 10 syllables in each line, and it was an important form in epic Italian poetry. In the poetry of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance of Italy, if someone really wanted to delve deeply, if you were an Italian poet and you wanted to delve deeply into an epic storytelling of some type, quite often they would select this particular form because a lot of the really great Italian epic poems were cast in this particular form. It's a little bit like saying if you were a jazz musician and you wanted to have a very earthy kind of music that you would write, you might choose the blues form, for example. You would write totally new music, but you cast it in the blues form. Or if you wanted to bring in some kind of visual arts form, a visual arts analogy, if you wanted to do something completely unique and new with a landscape, you would embrace this landscape genre, and you would see what you could do new with this landscape genre. So again, it's a poem of great contrasts, youth and aging, his personal growth, his reflections on eternity. And it was inspired by Byzantine images in Ravenna. And Ravenna is actually it's a church in Italy that was built at the end of the Middle Ages, and it was a church that was built using the central plan style instead of the basilica style, instead of that long, square public assembly building style. It embraced the central plan style because there was a lot more growth and transportation and commerce occurring between the Byzantine Empire, which was Christian at that point, and the homeland, the motherland, Rome and Italy, and the Vatican that was soon to be built there. So again, it's inspired by these Byzantine images. This is a photograph in Yeats in 1923. Very thoughtful man. And again, if you were to read the photograph as an artwork, we could learn a few things about his characteristic and a little bit about his personality. This is a manuscript page of his poem Sailing to Byzantium. This was republished in the New York Times in 2008. But you can see it's very interesting how he begins an idea. He works through it. He edits. He scratches lines out. He switches words around. He switches sections around. And you can see all this in his particular passage. If you look very carefully, yeah, here is no country for old men. There we go. The very first line out of this poem, and you can see what his other thoughts were. So I want you to take a look at this because it's important for us to remember and realize that art form does not spring fully formed from the mind and consciousness of a musician or a painter or a poet or a dancer. It comes through work. It comes through sketching, through revision. Now, some artists in different disciplines have had to go through a more extensive sketching or revision style than others and process than others. And here we have evidence that Yeats really had a lot of revision. He had a lot of ideas. He was putting them down on paper. But in order to get it just right, to express precisely what he wanted to express, he had to make a lot of choices. He had to rearrange things, and he had to eventually create this wonderful poem. But anyway, this is the manuscript page of his poem Sailing to Byzantium. Now here is the Basilica San Vitale in Ravenna, Italy. And again, this is a church that was built in the Middle Ages. It was built between 526 and 546 CE Common Era, otherwise known as AD. We have two photographs, a daytime photograph and a very dramatic nighttime photograph. But you will notice it is built on that central plan footprint, which is prevalent throughout the Middle East and throughout the Turkish Empire. But this is a Catholic Christian church. As the architecture grew and as new buildings were being built back in Italy, the church wanted to embrace more and more of what was going on in world culture. And so by building what was this new church at the time, using this style, this Byzantine style, this central plan style of architecture, it gives us some insights into the desire to wish to bring things together. It's not just a matter of we went to Constantinople and we built a basilica, old Roman style cathedral. No, we brought the architecture from there here, and we built this wonderful work here. But anyway, this is San Vitale in Ravenna, Italy. And here is an overhead drawing, so you can see the central plan architecture. You can see the central worship area in the middle, and you can see the entrance, and you can also see at the top a couple of niches, small little rooms and openings where special statues and special artwork could be kept. That's known as the presbytery. That is the presbytery refers to the idea of elders, where the elders of the church would go to that part to worship in certain times of the service. So the high church leadership would go into these smaller segments and say prayers and do other things in performing the worship. On the right, we see the apse, which is again this presbytery. And notice a couple things. Notice that there's a hemispherical dome. In other words, there's a dome on the top of all that. And there's also, if you look straight ahead, you will see the central figure being attended to by angels on the sides. Notice the windows allowing a great deal of light here, but notice the immense ornate decoration of this beautiful area. Up on the high left side, you see a series of medallions. Those medallions are, again, saints and martyrs, people who have died on behalf of the faith, and they're put in these circular cameos or medallions. That's a carryover from the Roman architectural tradition. Romans used to enjoy doing that, and the Christians picked up on that style as they begin adopting the Roman architectural styles for their own churches. You'll also notice over on the far left-hand side the extremely ornate Corinthian-influenced columns and capitals. You'll also see some other images. If you look very carefully over on the far left side, you will see an image of a tree and people around a tree. Again, more images and more stories from the Bible. Now, here's some of this stuff he may have been talking about. Here's the apse Mosaic, and this was created in 547. And this is Emperor Justinian of Constantinople and his entourage. Notice that his entourage includes both priests and scholars, as well as advisors and warriors. Justinian was the emperor of Constantinople. He was appointed as such, and he led Constantinople. His charge was to lead Constantinople and help develop that great city at the crossroads between the eastern part of the world and the western part of the world. And he did so quite well. He did it in part by some massive public building programs, including Hagia Sophia, and he was appointed in this very high level of responsibility. But you will notice there's also a halo around his head indicating spiritual favor in his particular work. And it is a mosaic. It's not a wall painting. Every one of those little bits of color is a little small piece of colored tile or colored glass that has been cemented or mortared onto the wall. And this is a little bit, and again, this was in Ravenna, and this is in honor of the current Byzantine emperor, you see. So again, there's more connections between East and West here. Here we have, again, in the apse, another mosaic, and this was Empress Theodora, and she was the wife of Justinian, and she was considered to be a co-regent, a co-ruler. Notice she also has a halo because she has a spiritual dimension to what she's involved with as well. Now, as you look on the left side, you'll notice this funny little curving of the imagery. That's not the way it appears in real life. That curving occurs because it's actually on a circular wall. And so they had, in order to be able to take this photograph so you could see it as a flat photograph, a special camera lens had to be used, and unfortunately straight lines are no longer straight lines. But it does give you an idea, if you looked from left to right, what you would see in another beautiful mosaic. Now here is another church in Ravenna, Italy. And it's a little bit more of a fusion of Eastern and Western architecture. Again, when we speak of Eastern, we're thinking of the central plan architecture, and Western, we're speaking of the Basilica, Old Roman influenced style architecture. It was built in 504 CE. It was reconsecrated or rededicated during the reign of Justinian. And so again, there's this very broad desire to join East and West, and to have the church having as much relationship as it could. But again, you look at it, you can see some elements of Eastern architecture, but there's a lot of Western architecture, especially as you look at this portico, this porch where people can go underneath before they enter into the church. And here we have some more interesting images. Now, this very well could have been the procession of the saints that Yeats was talking about, because look at all those saints and martyrs, that incredible line that goes from the far left all the way back. Again, this could have been that specific procession that Yeats was talking about. So we don't know if it's imagery and inspiration of San Vitale or San Apollinaire. We're not sure which of the two, but the thing is interesting is that perhaps an amalgamation of both, in the same way that the poem is not about a political city of Constantinople or Istanbul, but the poem is about a spiritual city and a time in history known as Byzantium. And again, here is another procession of the saints. Take a look at this. And again, this is on a curved wall, so you can see what the photographer had to do with the camera lens in order to be able to try to get this all in. It's pretty amazing. On the far right side, we have an image of Mary being seated, and we have Jesus as a baby sitting in her laps. That's that woman sitting in the dark clothing in the middle that's being flanked by those angels. And then again, we have the three wise men. Okay, we have three wise men. Again, the ones that are spoken of in the Bible, coming to bring gifts to the young child. And then we have an amazing procession of saints and angels that come after that. Notice above that we have numerous other important figures of the church, and they are all identified by the objects they're holding. If we knew about the specific symbology of certain lives of individuals, we would be able to say, oh, that one is Peter, that one's Bartholomew, and so on and so forth. But again, we have these great processions. Now, there's one other thing I want to point out. If you look at the very bottom here, you'll see that this is on an upper part of the roof, and you'll notice that there is basically 3 levels of architecture going on. There's a lower level, a middle level, and a higher level. And that is, interestingly enough, typical of Renaissance architecture. Buildings that were built in the Renaissance period, especially government buildings or palaces, if they were multi-level, they would usually have 3 levels or 3 ranges of level. The lowest level would be the roughest, the middle level would be next most polished, and then the top level would be the most polished or the most smooth in terms of outside stonework. Well, here there's almost a simulation of it. Here we have again the 3 levels, the porticos and supports that you cannot see very well. All you can see is the very tops of the arches. Then we have this middle layer, and then we have a very fine and very tiny detailed upper level as well. So again, a procession of the saints, and this is a mosaic in the San Apollinaire. Here is an interesting one. It's a combination of church and state, and it's Emperor Constantine, one of the great emperors of the Roman Empire, because he embraced the Christian faith. He was actually in this image granting privileges to the church. In other words, he allowed the church to have certain political privileges as well as the religious freedoms that they experienced. So here Constantine is handing a scroll of privileges to the church. And again, a mosaic in this. And this is in San Apollinaire. Now here is another interesting mosaic. This is the mosaic of Jesus of Christ sitting on his throne, his kingdom, with 4 angels, 2 on his right and 2 on his left. And again, this is one of those interesting and wonderful mosaics that you see. Now this, take a look at the halos. The angels have regular just disc-like halos, but notice that Jesus' halo has the shape of a cross in it. That is a carryover from iconography, from the creating of icons and images from the Greek Orthodox Church. And so there's some of this Greek Orthodox influence spilling over into Catholicism. But again, the Greek Orthodox Church and the Orthodox Church of Constantinople were highly similar. They did have relationships with Rome, so to speak, with the church in Rome, but it was a little bit different, a different kind of flavor. And again, here is the specific halo of Christ that has the crown in the top. Forming the crown, we have the cross. So we've seen a poem by Yeats, a 20th century Irish poet, expressing particular ideas, sharing very personal thoughts, and pointing us towards a vision of what he thinks the future could be like for him and for others. So it's a very interesting poem, Sailing Byzantium, but it does show us how ideas and imagery and ways of thinking from ancient cultures still impact us today, and we still share some of those same kinds of values and ideals.